does this accident amount to criminal conduct? And I have a feeling that the jury was fairly divided in the sense of, do you identify with Kim Potter? Do you think she, in that moment of adrenaline, she just reached for the wrong weapon? Or do you think there's so many things along the way that she should have done differently that this needs to be punished? Is it murder? No. Is it manslaughter? Yes. So I really think the fact that it took this long indicates that the jury was in fact struggling with whether or not this accident was in fact criminally leads to criminal culpability.
Now, we're saying this is an outcome and not a verdict. What happens if they are deadlocked?
If they are deadlocked, then the state can decide later to retry the case. And that's really up to the state. What they will probably do is they'll ask to poll the jury. They'll ask for as much information as possible from the jury. And they'll make a determination as to whether or not it makes sense to retry this case. And obviously that would be fairly far down the road. We're talking probably about months, not weeks.
Now, you mentioned this was a hard case for them to even review, but can you talk about how hard it would be to even pick a jury like this? How do you pick a jury, especially how our country is right now when you think that this happened just down the road, not too far from where a jury found Derek Chauvin guilty, and we've seen a lot of these cases play out. So that being said, how do you pick a jury that can really just look at the facts, review the case, and go about that way?
I'm going to give a completely dissatisfying answer, which is exactly as you said. You talk to the jury, you have a questionnaire, you do the process of voir dire, and you ask them. You might have your own opinions on X or Y. Obviously, we're all living through a moment of reckoning when it comes to our criminal justice system. Obviously, there's a deep racial context to what happened in this particular case. But you ask those jurors, can you separate out the political conversation, the larger conversation about what we want to do as a policy matter when it comes to criminal justice? Can you separate that out and make a decision just based on the facts of this case as they apply to the law here? And this is something we're all dealing with. I think we've asked so many of these cases, the Rittenhouse case, the Arbery case, we ask all these cases to bear a weight that's larger than what any criminal trial, in fact, can or potentially should. But you're exactly right that you want to be delicate when you're picking a jury, particularly when it's high profile, and make sure that the juries will take this seriously. This is one of the things that is really the bedrock of our criminal justice system, trying to ensure that these jurors, regardless of their life experience, can walk into that room and say, let's look at these particular facts as it applies to these particular laws.
That being said, let's talk about the prosecutors and the defense attorneys. Does public opinion weigh on their jobs? They're focused on this one case, but there's a much larger social conversation that you pointed out. How does that weigh, or does it weigh, on their tasks at hand?
Yeah, I'm going to say something that maybe is a little bit inconsistent, which is, of course, look, we're all humans. In every courtroom in the country, we're all aware of what's happening outside the courtroom. Even in a case where, for instance, the jury is sequestered, there's a reason a jury is sequestered, because there's so much happening outside of the courtroom in terms of coverage, in terms of potential bias. So yes, of course it comes into play, but I do think it's such an important question and good question, because it brings up this idea that any single criminal trial should not be asked to solve our bigger societal or policy problems. And so in some cases, I think that if it's helpful, you will hear from a prosecution or defense. And if it's relevant, if it's admissible, you'll hear them bring in either expressly or indirectly issues regarding the larger context. But trials really are just about what happened here. It's not about white people shooting black people. It's not about a larger problem of how do we solve issues regarding law enforcement. How do we solve inequalities? It's really about the decisions that Kim Potter made at that moment and whether or not it rises to criminal culpability.
Are you surprised the court is saying, again, they're saying that they've reached an outcome? Are you surprised that that is the language, that it's an outcome and not a verdict?
No, excuse me. No, all we know is that, well, let's look at the calendar, pardon me, and be honest here. You know, it's December 23rd. It's the afternoon. And this is typically when we do hear from juries. So I think the consensus was that we're going to hear from this jury either way, either that they will come with a verdict or they'll say we couldn't come to a conclusion because this jury just doesn't want to come back, I think, after the holidays. That's not unusual. You get a lot of verdicts on Friday afternoons, for instance.
Jessica Levinson, thank you. We want to now go to our coverage on CBSN Minnesota.
Of course, in a case like this, you would want the defendant to testify.
Anything else we should be thinking about, Joe, in terms of this this language trial outcome or anything in the case as we kind of do this prequel to what will be the main event coming up here in about 45 minutes?
Yes, this was a very unique case in the sense that the facts were not disputed. The prosecution and the defense agreed with all of the facts, and pretty much everything were on videos. But it all comes down to that one thing, which is, was it an accident or was she reckless, meaning she had no disregard for the rights and safety of others? So even after all of this testimony and physical evidence and the facts not in dispute, it takes days, obviously, for 12 people to determine whether or not this was proven.
Yeah, and again, as we stand right now, we don't know if it was proven or disproven, or if some of them believe the former and some believe the latter, because we're waiting for whatever this word is. So, Joe, I look forward to being on TV and here on CBSN with you again, and I believe we'll begin that around 1:30 this afternoon, and we'll see what Judge Chu has to say and what this jury has decided. It's certainly been interesting. So, thanks, everyone. When we get the trial outcome between 1:30 and 2, we'll be here live, as I mentioned, and we'll continue our coverage at that time. Thanks.
Four people are hurt after an explosion at an ExxonMobil refinery in Texas. According to Exxon, a fire broke out overnight at the Baytown, Texas facility. Residents in the area reported hearing a loud explosion coming from the plant. The cause of the fire is being investigated. The refinery's manager is apologizing to the community.
We will do a thorough investigation to make sure an event like this doesn't happen again. And we deeply we're really sorry for what's happened and the inconvenience that causes and stress that's caused to our neighbours.
All four people injured in the explosion are reported to be in stable condition. There are signs the job market is tightening as new jobless claims remain low. 205,000 Americans filed first-time unemployment applications for the week of December 18th. That number remains unchanged from the previous week's revised levels. This signifies job losses remain low this holiday season. However, health officials are expressing concerns over the impact the highly contagious Omicron variant could have on the economy in the new year. CBS News Money Watch reporter Irina Ivanova joins us now for more on this. Irina, thank you so much. Great to see you. Initial jobless claims usually increase during the winter months. Why are we seeing the number of applicants remain stagnant in the past 2 consecutive weeks? And is this a positive sign?
It is a really positive sign. And just for context, we have to remember we started this year with nearly 1 million new jobless claims every week. It has come way, way down. And this is basically another sign of just how tight the labor market has become, showing that employers are really not willing to lay off workers and will do anything they can to hold on to them because they're worried if they do have to lay people off, even if they're anticipating a downturn in business, it could be very, very hard to get those workers back. And so, as you noted, the number last week stayed the same as the week before, 205,000. And going into the holiday season, it's important to note, week to week, it might change a little bit. The number might go up and down. But this number is now lower than the typical weekly jobless claims before the pandemic. And a few weeks back, we actually hit a 50-year low. in the jobless claims. So all around, it remains a very tight job market.
President Biden says he will not be imposing widespread lockdowns, and we will not be returning to March of 2020 despite the latest spike in Omicron cases nationwide. However, we are seeing closures and event cancellations in several states, including right here in New York, where we are, and California. Are these voluntary, self-imposed closures something we should expect to see more of moving forward? And how severe a threat is the new wave of Omicron infections to the nation's economic recovery?
That's right, Elise. We can expect to see a lot more of these closures. I've talked to a number of economists about this. You know, nobody expects lockdowns coming. There's just no public appetite for it whatsoever. But we have been seeing a great deal of these more targeted, voluntary changes. So in New York City and Los Angeles, we've seen restaurants close, whether it's from an abundance of caution or because they have had staff who have been exposed. We've seen some large performances and sporting events being canceled. I spoke with Homebase this morning. They're a software provider to a lot of small, medium-sized businesses and leisure, hospitality, and retail. And so there hasn't actually been a drop in people working. But when they looked at the 10 counties in the country that are most tourist-dependent, so we're talking New York, California, the Disneylands, Washington, D.C., there's actually been a really big drop in the hours worked. It's about a 25% drop. And so economists are telling us that we should expect a hit to growth because of Omicron. Of course, the big question is we don't know how big that hit is going to be. Excuse me. It does depend on how severe the sickness ultimately ends up being and how people feel about their own personal risks. That said, the indications that we've seen so far, these restaurant closures, these event cancellations, large companies we've seen with return to office plans for January that have now been pushed back, some schools returning to remote schooling, which we know affects parents' ability to work. All of those relatively small changes are going to have an impact on the overall economic recovery.
So consumer spending rose a modest 0.6% last month. Unemployment is down, wages are up, and inflation is at record highs. Is this a positive sign, or are these lower numbers anticipated for the holiday season?
Yeah, so the consumer spending figure, to use a technical term, it's an okay number. It's not blowout figures like we've seen earlier in the holiday season, but we have had a very strong holiday spending season. When you compare this month to last year, spending on goods is up a great deal. It's up about 16%, and spending on services is down about 1%. So it's almost the same. And while we know consumers are saying they're anxious about inflation, households still have a lot of money saved up. All those stimulus checks, the added unemployment aid, child tax credits, overall, nationwide, households have about $2 trillion more dollars in their bank accounts than they normally would have. So there's still quite a lot of money left to spend, and consumer sentiment actually ticked up a little bit in December. All that told, I think we're looking at a pretty solid rest of the holiday spending season.
I like that technical term, okay. Irina Ivanova, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
We have breaking news in the fight against the coronavirus. The FDA is authorizing Merck's antiviral pill to treat the virus in the U.S. The pill is called Molnupiravir, and it is the second antiviral pill authorized by the agency in as many days. The FDA authorized its use in adults 18 and up with mild to moderate infections who are at risk for hospitalization or death. The announcement today comes one day after the FDA authorized Pfizer's COVID pill for people ages 12 and up. And potentially more good news. 3 different studies report that Omicron infections more often than not result in mild illness, and the risk of hospitalization is lower than it is with Delta. Despite the rise in treatments, the U.S. reported more than 238,000 new cases and over 2,000 deaths Wednesday. Omicron quickly became the dominant variant in the U.S. in a matter of weeks. The variant made up of 73% of all new cases in the country. And in high transmission areas, that number goes up to 90%, which is why so many are rushing to get tested as families prepare to gather for the Christmas holiday. CBS News' Michael George has more.
The FDA has authorized a second COVID-19 pill, a Merck drug for high-risk adults who test positive to take at home when no other options are available. It comes a day after the agency granted emergency use authorization for Pfizer's more effective antiviral pill. The FDA found Paxlovid significantly reduced the risk of hospitalization for those at risk of serious illness.
This is a very promising antiviral, and therefore we want to make sure that production is ramped up as quickly as possible.
The new treatments come as the Omicron variant continues to surge. Studies from overseas appear to show Omicron cases are less severe, but health experts say the country can't let its guard down.
If you're unvaccinated, don't think that it's going to be a milder version of this virus. You shouldn't assume that at all. It could be really dangerous to do that.
Some hospitals are already overwhelmed. The ICU in Michigan's Beaumont-Dearborn Hospital is at 98%. A team of military members has been sent to help.
It's really the unknown. We are in a perfect storm.
The New York City area is experiencing a record number of cases, and about 20 urgent care centers have temporarily closed due to staff shortages and burnout. As cases explode right before Christmas, the demand for at-home tests has skyrocketed.
I tried to buy some several days ago, and I went to several places. They're sold out everywhere.
And starting tomorrow, Universal Orlando will once again require face coverings for guests and team members indoors. Michael George, CBS News, New York.
We want to bring in Dr. Jeremy Faust. He's an emergency physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School and author of Inside Medicine on Bulletin.com. Dr. Faust, thank you so much for joining us. I want to jump right in. Let's begin with the approval of Merck's COVID pill just a day after the approval of Pfizer's. What type of impact do you expect them to have in the COVID fight, and how will healthcare workers determine which pill is best for their patient?
Thank you for having me. It's great news that we have therapeutics that work, and we'll see how well they work in real life outside of trials, and we'll see how well they work in terms of distribution, because that's the big question. These can be expensive, and we are going to rely on some help in terms of the finances here. I think there are certainly some questions in terms of who gets these pills. I think that there's a question of fairness. The people who need them the most are the ones who should get it. I don't subscribe to this idea that if you've chosen to be unvaccinated, you don't deserve these pills. Look, I want everybody to get vaccinated, but you don't turn around and then deny them care for the things that they need later on. Merck has probably a little bit more of a safety profile to watch. There's some question about mutations. I don't think it's a serious issue, but pregnant patients may not want this. So it'll be an on-the-ground decision. The question as to whether which one works better, certainly the Pfizer seems to have an edge, but I really tend to think that once we see it in real life, we will know. I think these will help things, but because of the expense and just getting these pills out, I still believe that the best way to end this is through vaccination, and these are a good thing to have in your back pocket when you have infections.
So you and a colleague sent a memo to CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky advocating for a specific method to help fight the spread of Omicron. Tell us about that method and the term circuit breakers.
The idea of a circuit breaker is it's not a shutdown, it's not a lockdown, and it's not blunt. It's very nimble. We want to make sure the goal of circuit breakers is very narrow. It is to make sure that hospitals do not overflow so that they can continue to provide life-saving care for COVID and for non-COVID alike. And we now can leverage real-time data in ways that we could not before. So we can leverage HHS federal data, and we can use data on hospitalization rates, on how many case counts there are per day, how many beds there are in every single county in the country. And we can tell a county, hey, you are at risk of filling up because we know that, for example, your beds are 90% full today. And we can say that based on the case counts you're seeing right now in the past few days, even if a very small number of them end up being hospitalized a few days from now, that you're going to fill up those beds. And we now can actually make those projections in real time. And this should trigger an on-the-ground assessment, because I think that if the hospitals can't provide care that would save lives usually, I think that's just a completely really unsustainable and terrible idea. And in that situation, we would recommend a circuit breaker, which would be a limitation in capacity for indoor dining or arenas, large gatherings, because these low-hanging fruit, just a little bit of change in that way can actually get us away from the edge of where the hospitals are no longer safe.
And we definitely don't want to be on that edge. Are you taking a different approach with the Omicron variant than you did with Delta?
I do not take much solace in the studies that came out today saying that Omicron is milder. And I'll tell you, there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, I think that people are getting the wrong impression maybe. If it's a little bit milder, it might be the equivalent of if you were driving and you hit a brick wall going 90 miles an hour, and now it's only 75 miles an hour. I still think that that's a bad impact. And so if Omicron had been the first variant that we'd seen, this still had almost all of the potential to cause illness and death as the other variants. So the second piece is maybe the studies we're seeing are what we call confounded. They're influenced by the fact that the populations that we're looking at have a degree of existing immunity from prior infections. That does matter, and it's important to just acknowledge that. And also, but probably better than that, the number of people who've been vaccinated and boosted as appropriately. So likely what we're seeing is that we have a more immune population. I suspect that among the immune naive, those who've never been vaccinated and those who have never been infected, that Omicron is not much milder for those people. They are still at high risk. If it's a little milder, that's great, but I think it's probably not a game changer amount of change in that direction. So I want people to be very, very cautious with this variant.
Yeah, definitely always cautious. You're recommending short-term restrictions to fight the spread, but it's apparent that many people are just over lockdowns, shutdowns, or anything restrictive. How do you reconcile safety recommendations with a nation that is worn out from this pandemic?
We are worn out. And that's why I think that asking for narrow action is actually the best thing. We're not advocating for a system-wide shutdown or even a local shutdown. It's very specific. I'll give you an example. With 2,200 counties that we can report on, almost 2,000 of them have not reached the circuit breaker threshold that we recommend. So we would say, look, we know you have COVID in those areas and we want you to stop the spread there, but that's not what this metric does. For the other 100 to 200 counties that are on that edge or over the edge, we want to say, look, maybe we can all get behind this one idea, which is that the hospitals need to have space for you if you get sick. So I think that people are tired of doing things that don't have a clear outcome and that don't have a clear on-ramp and off-ramp. And we provided that very clearly because we don't want people to think that we're fooling them into something greater. Like if we say, look, we think this can last for 5 to 7 days, a decrease in capacity or limitations on indoor dining or something to that nature, 5, 7, 10 days, but not more than 14, because that's really all we think is necessary. And so we foresee a future in which there's a few days at a time where we limit things, but we don't want to be in a situation where we're asking people to do things for 1, 2, 3 weeks because they just won't do it. And so we would rather have something that's good rather than something that's perfect. And this arms people with that tool. And we hope that because it's so specific and narrow that they will be willing to do something. And if it works, they'll feel good about it, because that's one thing. People hate losing. We love winning. So let's give them some wins.
Well, Dr. Jeremy Faust, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Sentence reviewed still to come after the nationwide outrage of a 110-year prison term given to a truck driver. There are signs prosecutors are reconsidering the lengthy sentence. Plus,
I'm Steve Hartman. I've spent the past year traveling this country, finding stories that embody not only the holiday spirit, but also showed the power of the human connection. We've compiled some of those stories in the CBS News special, On the Road, Home for the Holidays. We'll talk about it next, right here on CBSN.
Welcome to CBS Mornings.
Up next, stories you'll be talking about today. That's a big deal.
People stop me on the street and say, I always learn something new every day when I watch your show.
This morning, we're going to begin with some good news.
Oh, you just put me in a good mood.
Just follow me. I'll lead the way.
There's always something new under the sun. CBS Mornings, weekdays on CBS.
an original documentary on CBSN.
We need to put an end to this territorial status.
Will statehood create a better Puerto Rico?
So that we have the same quality of life that you see in the States.
What do you worry about?
Me living here in the future.
They're giving incentives to non-Puerto Ricans to come to Puerto Rico
and extract our natural resources and take over our land.
Vacation in Puerto Rico, and in exchange for that, you don't pay taxes.
Why would I allow somebody who abused me for 123 years to then consume me?
An originals documentary on CBSN. Stream now.
If it's important to our nation,
the country is facing yet another unprecedented crisis.
It's on Face the Nation.
You heard the president. Where do you think this stalemate goes from here?
Making politics make sense.
What do you think happened here?
The why behind the biggest stories. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
An original documentary on CBSN.
50 shows running, the lights blinking.
People fight their entire career to get to Broadway.
You've trained your entire life.
Spotlights, drama, passion.
This is what we live for.
Until COVID turned off the lights.
It's like going from a bright light to pitch black.
Scenes from Broadway's unique struggle with COVID.
It was devastating.
Broadway contributes about $15 billion to New York City's economy and 100,000 jobs.
The sound team, the lighting team, everyone.
The world does not realize how big this is.
This is how we make money.
This is a specialized industry. You don't tell a doctor to go get a serving job. You just, why are we different?
Are we going to be able to pay our rent? Am I going to have food?
What will happen in Broadway's new opening act?
We're in uncharted waters again.
The show must go on.
There is reason to hope again.
I think people are going to be crying. I know I will.
An originals documentary on CBSN. Stream now.
Everything was on fire.
You're left making decisions you don't want to make.
If we're at war at fire, we're going to spend a lot of money, we're going to take a lot of casualties, and we're going to lose. We got to do something about it.
Most people didn't cry when they got their bills, but when he made them feel like $1 million,
do you know how special you are?
That's when the joy came.
For 15 years, Steve Hartman has been covering a Secret Santa on his mission of kindness, but that's not the only person's journey he's followed. Every week, Steve brings a new and heartwarming story into our homes, showing us yet another person doing their part to make the world just a little bit nicer. CBS News has put together some of the best on-the-road stories from this year for a special called Home for the Holidays. You can watch it tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern here on CBSN. But first, we want to bring in the man responsible for bringing us all the tear-jerking and uplifting stories from across the country. Steve Hartman joins me now to talk more about his holiday special. Steve, great to see you, as always.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
What can people expect from your Home for the Holidays special?
Well, as you said, this is some of our favorite stories, and it's really hard to pick favorites because I'm a little obsessive about these stories that we tell, and they all become my favorites. So, but we've assembled a group of some of the favorites, and it's kind of a cliff notes for anybody who didn't catch the segment on a regular basis. This is your one and final chance to catch up and see some really life-affirming stories.
They're amazing stories. I look forward to them. Now, we are following breaking news. A Minnesota jury has reached an outcome in the trial of former officer Kim Potter. The judge just returned to the courtroom. We're going to listen in to that decision, which will be read shortly.
All right, please be seated. Members of the jury, have you arrived at a verdict? Okay. Will the deputy please retrieve the verdict forms and provide it to me for review? Would Ms. Potter please rise? I'm now going to read your verdicts as it will appear in the permanent court records of Hennepin County. In the matter of State of Minnesota versus Kimberly Potter, court file number 27 CR 217490, we, the jury, on the charge of manslaughter in the first degree while committing a misdemeanor on or about April 11, 2021, in Hennepin County, State of Minnesota, find the defendant guilty. And the verdict was agreed to at the hour of 11:40 a.m. and signed by the jury person on 12/23/21. The verdict on count 2 is we, the jury, on the charge of manslaughter in the second degree, culpable negligence on or about April 11, 2021, in Hennepin County, State of Minnesota, find the defendant guilty. And that verdict was agreed to at 10:30 a.m. on 12/21/21. Members of the jury, is this your true and correct verdict? So say you one, and so say you all.
Yes.
Okay, you may be seated. All right, I am now going to poll the jury. Juror number 2, is this your true and correct verdict?
It is.
Juror number 6, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes, it is.
Juror number 7, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes, it is.
Juror number 13, is this your true and correct verdict? Oh, it's juror 11. And juror 17, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 19, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 21, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 22, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 26, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 40, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes.
Juror number 48, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes.
And juror number 55, is this your true and correct verdict?
Yes, it is.
Members of the jury, when you first came into the courtroom, I told you that jurors are the heroes of our judicial system. Well, the 12 of you are our heroes in this case. You might remember that there was a question on the questionnaire that asked whether you wanted to be on this jury. You were to check yes, no, or maybe. A number of you checked no or not sure, and a few of you checked all three. But when I asked each of you if you would be willing to serve if the party selected you as a juror, you all said yes. You said yes even though we are in a pandemic with Omicron spreading in our community. You said yes even though you had concerns about serving given the nature of the case. You said yes even though you knew you would be sequestered during deliberations and away from your loved ones. And you said yes even though there was a chance that this case could have lasted past Christmas. You were willing to sacrifice much because you believed in our justice system. And then you went into deliberations, and each of you brought with you your common sense, individual perceptions, and life experiences, and you came to an agreement on the verdicts. You did your duty. I'm so proud of you. You should be proud of yourselves. Without civic-minded citizens like you, our system of justice could not function. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifices. I wish you all a wonderful holiday season, and may the peace and beauty of the season be yours throughout the year. At this time, I'd like you to go into your waiting courtroom, and I'll be in just a moment. I'd like to thank you personally and to answer any questions that you have. Okay? Okay, please be seated. All right, Counsel, we have to pick a date tentatively for sentencing. So for in custody, we'll be taking Ms. Potter into custody and holding without bail. So what is 3 weeks out? I think we probably want to do a tier 4.
So we will be looking at January 13th or 14th. We can do 11:30 on either day.
For sentencing?
For sentencing.
Your Honor, pre-sentence report?
Yes, I'm having a PSI report done.
We are not available on the 13th. I believe we could do the 14th.
I'm in trial the week after that, and it does seem to be a little accelerated given the seriousness of the decisions you're about to make. So later in January would be our preference. We also would like to talk about the bail issue with you before you decide it, before you make a decision to take her in.
All right, I'll hear you out.
Go ahead, no.
You know, I think it'd be easier for the court reporter if you went to the podium.
We both say a little bit, Judge.
Yes.
Well, there hasn't been a motion. I anticipate they would file a motion, but this arguendo, they're going to file a motion to revoke her bail. We will be filing a motion for dispositional departure on the case. She is amenable to probation. Her remorse and regret for the incident is overwhelming. She's not a danger to the public whatsoever. She has made all her court appearances, including all appearances in the court. It is the Christmas holiday season. She's a devoted Catholic, no less. And there is no point to incarcerate her at this point in time because A, you haven't decided what the sentence is going to be. B, the dispositional departure arguments are quite strong on this case. And C, it's not necessary for the preservation of public safety. So for those reasons, she need not be incarcerated whatsoever pending sentencing. You certainly can do it after sentencing, but this is a rather unique case of someone who has law enforcement experience and was never in trouble in all her life and is 49, which is beyond the age of most defendants that you see. Plus she has deep roots in the community and her family's here, and there's no evidence that she would flee. So we respectfully ask you to change your mind as to whether she needs to be incarcerated right now. I know Mr. Gray has a couple comments too.
Your Honor, her bail right now is $100,000. She's got that posted. She's not going to run. She obviously is not going to commit any more crimes. She's been convicted of an accident. She's been convicted of being reckless. I just would like to be able to, with Paul, file a motion for dispositional departure in this case. I think there's other facts that didn't come to light during the trial that are important also about Kim Potter and about this case. So I respectfully request that you release her on her $100,000 bail, and that'll make it easier to do the pre-sentence report. We'll get people sending letters on her behalf. And I would ask for the sentencing sometime after, if you release her, sometime, I start a trial January 20th. It should be over by February 20th, I hope, sometime in late February. And ask that my gosh, she's got a $100,000 bail up, Judge. But, she's not going to commit another crime. She's not going anywhere. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. We do request that the defendant be taken into custody. The convictions here are for manslaughter in the first degree, manslaughter in the second degree, based on the death of Daunte Wright, a young man. In other words, it's a case that involves a death. They are very serious charges. It is customary for defendants to be taken into custody upon a guilty verdicts for those level of crimes, and we don't think this case should be any differently. Your Honor, we also have learned that the defendant is not living in the state. I don't know if that was known and provided for in the original conditions of release, but it presents obviously an aggravating factor for allowing her to remain out of custody. So we are requesting that the state remand her into custody and withdraw any bail or conditions of release. Your Honor, we do have the Blakely issue to resolve, and we would be asking some direction from the court on whether we should submit written arguments or proposed findings, or how the court exactly wants to address that. It would be good to have those findings, of course, for the actual sentencing hearing, and we would request a PSI as well.
Judge, may I respond?
Yes.
It's a serious crime, I understand that, but both of those crimes, there's no intent, no criminal intent. It's reckless and culpable negligence. Many times in my career, I've had defendants convicted of culpable negligence. I don't think I've ever had a reckless one, but it's an unintentional crime by somebody with a clear record, and we have a strong basis for a dispositional departure. I asked the court to release her on the bail. She surely will reappear.
Okay. The presumptive sentences in this case are commits, and I am going to require that she be taken into custody and held without bail. And I recognize your arguments, Mr. Ng and Mr. Gray, but I cannot treat this case any differently than any other case. So, I think we should probably set briefing deadlines. I know that the defense would like to make a written motion for dispositional departure, and the state has the argument concerning aggravating Blakely factors that we should be briefing. How much time does the defense need to put in their motion for dispositional departure?
At least 1 month. We're backed up. Both of us are backed up on trials right now. I start one on the 20th as well.
Okay.
So at least 1 month from at the end of January, preferable.
Okay. Pick a date in January, and I'll give the state what they need to respond.
Well, the January 31st.
January
Yes.
31st, that's a Monday.
Okay. And how long would the state like to respond to the motion, the sentencing motion?
Could we have 2 weeks, Your Honor?
You may, and that date would be, Zach?
February 14th.
Okay. And Mr. Frank, I think that the aggravating factors, we did the Blakely on a unitary basis, so no further evidence would be required, correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
So could you submit your brief on the aggravating factors? How much time do you need on that?
2 weeks, Your Honor.
Okay. And the defense would need until... Okay. And Mr. Kramer, could you tell them what the dates are?
Why don't we do them all on the 31st then? You might as well have an omnibus submission for the defense.
Okay. Do you want to do them simultaneously on the 31st?
That's fine, Your Honor.
Okay. All right. So, you want sentencing pushed back to February? All right, because both of you are late February. All right, let's pick a date.
We could do any time in the morning on February 23rd.
Well, I know I'm in trial on the 20th too. I mean, all these cases were backed up because of this one. So late the week after that would be great.
Okay. That'll push us to the first week of March. How about 9 a.m. on March 1st?
Okay.
What day of the week?
That's a Tuesday.
Your Honor, the state's not available that week.
Okay.
Okay. Let's do March 8th at 9 a.m.
I'm sorry.
March 8th at 9 a.m.
We all have a state trial that week in March. If we could move it up a week in February would be better. Please.
So the first week of March, Mr. Frank?
I'm saying like the third week of February.
Okay. Well, we could do it February 18th at 9 a.m.
That's fine.
That is a Friday.
What day, Paul?
February 18th.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
February 18th, Judge.
Thank you. All right, is there anything else we need to put on the record?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you, counsel.
Love you, Kim.
A jury in Minnesota has convicted former police officer Kim Potter of manslaughter in the death of Daunte Wright. And for more on this, we want to bring in CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, why did the jury have such a hard time with this case?
Well, I think because, the facts weren't in dispute. It wasn't necessarily clear to them whether or not this accident rose to the level of being criminally culpable. And I also think, honestly, because when we talk about manslaughter and we talk about words like culpable negligence, or reasonably foreseeable, that these are words that are open to interpretation. But obviously, if you find actions that fall within it, there's huge repercussions for, in this case, Kim Potter. And so I think that the jury was also struggling with these fairly broad terms that allow them really to exercise their discretion. Was it reasonably foreseeable that when Kim Potter reached for that weapon, that she was potentially putting Mr. Wright in this type of grave danger? What does it mean to be culpably negligent? A lot of it deals with things like the reasonable person standard, and that's not necessarily always straightforward. Clearly, the crimes here weren't ones where the prosecution had to show intent. In some ways, it can be more difficult to try and convince a jury that somebody should reasonably foresee something.
The jury deliberated for about 28 hours, and as the news broke, we saw a lot of people analyzing that it would be a hung jury, but they did find her guilty on 2 manslaughter charges. What do you think it was about the prosecution's case that persuaded jurors to convict Kim Potter?
You know, it's interesting. I've thought about this because it is on the kind of outside of the time frame where you might expect. And I think what helped the prosecutors actually is when the jury came back and they said, can we hold the weapon? I believe that there was a question of basically, can we hold the gun when it's not loaded? That they were really trying to figure out, if I was in her position and I grabbed for a gun, not a taser, would I understand that quickly in that moment? Would it be reasonably foreseeable? Should a reasonable person understand that that's a gun and not a taser, particularly a reasonable person who's trained on that? So I think that was very helpful for the prosecution. Obviously, the prosecution didn't have to argue any facts that were in dispute here. I think a lot of this was arguments also on the idea of some police accountability, on the idea that based on her training. And frankly, I think that the prosecution also had a good moment on cross-examination when they said, well, was there any threat to you? Or was this just somebody who was trying to evade arrest? And did you try and help after the shooting? I think those were two really helpful moments for the prosecution.
There was a little back and forth about her sentencing, about Kim Potter's sentencing. The judge initially said 3 weeks from now. They threw out the date January 13th, January 14th, and the judge said that, you know, she would be held without bail. Her defense argued that it was Christmas. She is a devout Catholic. She wants to go home. She will continue to be held without bail, and she will be sentenced in early March. What will Kim Potter's sentencing look like?
So what we heard in all of that, and this is kind of an amazing education for a lot of people who don't look and see what's happening in courtrooms every day. What we heard is a lot of discussion of scheduling. Why? Because both sides are going to put forward their sentencing memos, their arguments for why the sentence should be lower than the maximum, which I believe is 15 years here for that first-degree manslaughter, and or why it should be at or close to the maximum. There's some things that are not in dispute. Kim Potter has not been in trouble before, but you heard both sides say, well, there's some issues that didn't come out in trial, and I think that they would be helpful, Your Honor, for you to hear for sentencing. So what the judge said in this case is, I can't treat this defendant as any different from anybody else, so she will be behind bars before sentencing. And then as we talked about for sentencing, basically the prosecution is going to say, here's why there are some aggravating factors, or here's why the sentence should be higher. The defense will say, this is somebody who poses no risk to the community, and here are some mitigating factors. Here's why the sentence should be lower than for a first-time offender who is convicted of these charges.
You just mentioned that the judge said that she cannot treat this case like any other case, right? But it is in the background. What is in the background is the Derek Chauvin case, which happened not too long ago, right in this same area. And the jury found both officers, well, now former officers, guilty in those deaths. Does that surprise you? Does that show a changing of the tide in these cases?
So in a way, I'm of two minds. So there are two cases with facts regarding police officers who committed actions that led to deaths. Obviously, very different cases in terms of Officer Chauvin being convicted of murder, in terms of former Officer Potter here being convicted of manslaughter, but similarities: 2 white police officers, 2 black victims. And so in some ways we can say, is this a moment where juries' minds are changing, where they're becoming more attuned to the need for police accountability? On the other hand, I think we should be careful about drawing too many conclusions and creating kind of broader themes, because 2 of these trials happen somewhat close in time and have some similarities. Now, it may be the case that we see juries changing in terms of when they're exercising their discretion for what's foreseeable. In what situations can we say a police officer must be held accountable? But I do want to be careful just based on 2 cases. I don't know that this represents a sea change when it comes to how juries will think about these cases against police officers.
When the verdict was read, Kim Potter was pretty stoic, quite different than what we saw her in her testimony. We did see, however, one of the defense attorneys kind of collapse on the desk a bit. He seemed to be a little more verbal, I guess, in his body language. And then there are arguments to why she should not be in custody. What did you think of that? He said that it's Christmas, she's a devout Catholic, her family would want to see her. Was that a strong argument, you think, knowing the case?
I think that it was about as strong as he possibly could have made it. So he obviously is saying here, I think what he's saying is two things. Basically, Your Honor, please take pity on her. It's Christmas. It's a holiday that's deeply important to her and her family. And also taking aside the emotional aspect of this, saying she's not a risk. And maybe I heard the attorney saying, look, we don't know what your sentence is going to be. Your sentence could be no time. And therefore, if there is going to be time served, there's no reason that we can't put this off. That's about as strong as a defense attorney can get in terms of arguing there's really no public purpose to putting this person behind bars. Was it persuasive? Obviously, not to the judge who said, basically, I understand what you're saying. Under the subtext, I understand the emotion here, but I can't treat this case as different, again, subtext, just because we're on TV. And so that, I think the defense really argued everything they could, but the judge really clearly saying, this wouldn't fly for another defendant, so it can't fly for this defendant.
Jessica Levinson, thank you.
Thank you.
We want to now go to our coverage on CBSN Minnesota.
So it could look at that. So, Joe, anything else surprise you? I know we've had so many surprises and twists and turns in this case. This all appeared very straightforward today, the verdict phase.
Yes, the verdict was straightforward. The only thing that surprised me in the case was basically when Ms. Potter testified, she testified last, which I still question. We discussed that before, as well as the jury had that issue of what did she say or when did she say it to her expert, Dr. Miller. So, and remember what she supposedly said to Dr. Miller was that she saw a gun in her hand. And as you and I have discussed, we always thought that was consequential, but there was never an explanation given by the defense for that. So that still sticks in my mind.
Joe, I never asked you, but I've thought about it. Why is that conversation she had with Dr. Miller public knowledge? Why isn't it just I'm talking to this psychologist? Is it because he testified? All that had to be on the record? Can she not? She couldn't have had a conversation with her therapist or with this doctor without having that be in the record?
Because he testified. He was the expert. He took what she said, as well as all of his expertise, and developed an opinion, and that's what he gave on the stand. But by having Ms. Potter testify last, remember, the expert wasn't able to see her testimony. Dr. Miller even stated on the stand, well, I haven't heard her testify, because obviously he testified before her. So when your expert, your doctor, your therapist, whoever it may be, gets on the stand as a witness for you, yes, whatever you have told them will be admissible.
The defense wanted to get in all this prior information about Daunte Wright in terms of arrests, the fact that he's missed 5 court dates, some other run-ins having to do with a gun in the Minneapolis police. Does any of that play into the sentencing part, Joe?
No, because what would happen is if the defendant knew of all those things, it would have been admissible in court. Since it was not admissible, it will not come into play in question. Okay. Yes, the judge will consider the factors surrounding the defendant, the factors surrounding the victim's family, but as to whether or not Mr. Wright had whatever type of record or relationship with the police, that won't be considered.
So you're looking at the crowd that's gathered outside the government center. What we believe is going to happen is Earl Gray and Paul Lang may have an opportunity, if they like, to go ahead and speak to the press. Those are the attorneys that defended Kim Potter. And if they do, we'll go ahead and take that live. If they don't, we do expect and have been told that Attorney General Keith Ellison, whose office took this case over and prosecuted it, will go ahead and make a statement. In the meantime, though, we want to get to WCCO's Jeff Wagner. He's outside of the courthouse in Minneapolis. Jeff, I've seen a couple different shots. It's hard for me to gauge the size of that crowd there.
As I look back on myself, Frank, I'd say at least more than 100 people, approaching 200 people. It was only how many months ago when this entire courtyard and into the street was filled with masses of people related to the George Floyd trial, Derek Chauvin trial, and that guilty verdict. Although that crowd was much larger, I still think the feeling that is being expressed here is similar. It sounds like a Daunte Wright rally. It sounds like the protests we've attended over the past several months, but with that energy, there's also smiles, hugs, handshakes I'm seeing. Clearly, the crowd here is pleased with the verdict. It's what they've always wanted, but we're still just hearing those ongoing chants of say his name, Daunte Wright, mentioning how Potter is now guilty. I'll step out of the way for a second, and you can see what I'm talking about. That crowd, again, relatively small in comparison to what we saw here just about a week or so after Daunte Wright was killed. That was when the verdict happened in the Derek Chauvin trial. Guilty there, and again, guilty here today. It's also the middle of winter as well, but still a nice day. But this crowd that is out here right now is excitedly expressing how they feel. We're hearing some horn honking in the background. This is what they've been arguing for, fighting for. This is what this group has been wanting this entire week as we've awaited this verdict, which even today was still unclear as to what it would be when the wording came out as an outcome was reached. I think there was doubt in this crowd that a guilty verdict was to come about, but we came to learn it was not just guilty, but guilty on both counts.
Yeah, it is a all-around win for the defense. Jeff, we heard that there was some cheering going on when the verdict was read. We had our camera in the courtroom. Were you there? Was that those folks outside, or was it people actually in the government center?
I actually just arrived here. I heard the verdict in my car as I was approaching downtown, so I can't speak to where that cheer came from, but I'd have to imagine that everyone here was on their phones, no different than to downtown. I saw several people who were still just sitting in their cars. You could tell probably trying to listen to the verdict, I would imagine, on the radio. And as I was walking to the station, there were people standing outside just with their phones out, either live streaming a TV station or also listening to a radio. So I think there was that moment in time here across the city, across the metro, maybe across the country, where people just waiting to hear that verdict. And if they let out a loud cheer, this group had been out here throughout the day. I imagine it's this group as well.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. We've had a number of those moments that have all emanated from Minneapolis. Jeff, we'll check back with you in a little bit. Certainly appreciate it. WCCO's Adam Duxter is outside of the police station in Brooklyn Center. That, of course, was the site of a number of riots and protests back in April. But Adam, I can't tell. It looks pretty calm behind you. What's going on?
Yeah, Frank, when the verdict was read out, the one demonstrator who had been here for the better part of today packed up their belongings and left. And now there's not a single person outside of the Brooklyn Center Police Department here on Humboldt Ave. But we have heard from the folks who live at the Sterling Square apartments, which of course are right across from the police station here in Brooklyn Center. And those folks, I would say the general feeling is relief for them. We talked to a couple of folks who came out to speak with us, and they said, what they wanted to avoid for themselves was what happened here last year and last spring, and they were on edge and anxious, deservedly so, ahead of this verdict, but say for that verdict to go the way it did for them is a relief, and they feel like they can exhale and know that there likely will not be any big demonstrations here outside the police department today. But as we look ahead, we know the changes here in Brooklyn Center are still ongoing, and that was regardless of what the verdict was going to be today. Of course, we're referencing the sweeping changes and policies that were passed by the city council here in Brooklyn Center earlier this month, and that was something that was proposed by Mayor Mike Elliott shortly after. We're talking late last spring, early last summer, and we know that those changes will include a number of things, from reducing the number of police officers here in Brooklyn Center to coming up with a team of mental health professionals that can respond to mental health related calls here in Brooklyn Center, as well as creating a civilian traffic response team that they say will respond to non-moving traffic violations, and that will be made up of a team of civilians that are unarmed. So again, definitely a sense of relief here in Brooklyn Center. Earlier today, we talked with folks who live here, and they said even though they didn't know what was to come at that point, they did know that regardless of the verdict at that point, the changes were going to come sweeping with it after.
Yeah, I look at the concrete barriers and the height of that fence behind you, and it looks like they were prepared for the worst, and they were hoping for the best, and the best is the verdict for that community, I suppose. Many people in it, especially the people who live nearby, Adam.
And we knew there were multiple kind of precautions taken in preparation for this verdict. The local school district expands their winter break by 2 weeks, going to January 3rd. And when that decision was made earlier this month, the superintendent there, Carly Baker, says at that point they were just trying to protect families, regardless, again, of the verdict, just from any sort of situations or any sort of challenges that would come with that verdict. But again, those precautions now we know were made, and they are feeling very relieved here in Brooklyn Center. But again, I really want to stress the folks we talked to earlier today that call this place home say they are looking ahead to the changes that are going to come because of what happened here last April.
It's been a ride. It's been rough around here, but hopefully it changes for the better.
You've seen a lot of changes as far as like things that you would thought wouldn't have been, like for police and all that stuff like that. And it's a lot of things going on as far as crime, man. A lot of people think like, oh, they're untouchable. Thinking like, I can't go through this and I can do that. And police, I just try, police was like, it's crazy. It's very crazy, and just people like violence and stuff like that. We really do need a change.
And so certainly we know for the folks that live here in Brooklyn Center, this doesn't end with the verdict, right? The situation will still continue to develop and move and be shaped over the course of the next weeks and months and even years. But that gentleman that we spoke with there, who you just heard from, told us the big thing that they wanted to avoid and that people here were really worried about was the possibility that this could have ended in some sort of mistrial and they would have to try this case again later on. And he said that would have been the worst case scenario, because not only does it make the families have to relive everything that went down here this past April, but also it would, in a sense, make the community also have to relive just about everything that happened. And again, like you said, Frank, this was the spot for a bit more than a week that we saw massive protests and riots across from the Brooklyn Center Police Department. And, well, you mentioned the barricades are up. There's, no one out here, and folks drive by, laying on the horn. And some folks, again, from the neighboring apartment complex we heard from say that this is just a sense for them, mainly of relief.
Adam Duxter, live in Brooklyn Center outside the police department. Thank you very much. Folks, if you're just joining us, I'm sure you've heard, Kim Potter has been found guilty of manslaughter 1 and manslaughter 2. A jury of 6 men and 6 women delivered that verdict after delivering for at least 27, perhaps up to 28 hours. They got the case on Monday, and they just wrapped it up late this morning, and we heard the verdict early this afternoon. And here's that moment in court.
Members of the jury, have you arrived at a verdict? Okay. Will the deputy please retrieve the verdict forms and provide it to me for review? Would Ms. Potter please rise? I'm now going to read your verdicts as it will appear in the permanent court records of Hennepin County. In the matter of State of Minnesota versus Kimberly Potter, court file number 27 CR 21 7490, we, the jury, on the charge of manslaughter in the first degree while committing a misdemeanor on or about April 11, 2021, in Hennepin County, State of Minnesota, find the defendant guilty. And the verdict was agreed to at the hour of 11:40 a.m. and signed by the jury person on 12/23/21. The verdict on count 2 is we, the jury, on the charge of manslaughter in the second degree, culpable negligence on or about April 11, 2021, in Hennepin County, State of Minnesota, find the defendant guilty. And that verdict was agreed to at 10:30 a.m. on 12/21/21. Members of the jury, is this your true and correct verdict? So say you one, and so say you all.
Yes.
Okay, you may be seated.
So that was the moment that Kim Potter was found guilty of manslaughter 1 and 2. Shortly after that, there were some motions to decide whether or not she should go directly to jail or be allowed to stay out of jail under $100,000 bond. Judge Chu said you need to go to jail, and that is where she will spend Christmas Eve starting tomorrow, actually starting this evening. So there are a number of reporters from around the country and even the world, as you can imagine, covering this in Minneapolis. And every day there is a lottery to determine which 2 reporters can actually be in the courtroom. And WCCO is very fortunate that our David Schumann won the lottery and was actually in the courtroom as that verdict was read. And here's a report that he was able to file.
I'm David Schumann in the Hennepin County Courthouse, where Kim Potter has just been found guilty of both counts of manslaughter that she was charged with. I was one of 2 pool reporters in the courtroom when it happened. When that verdict was read, Kim Potter didn't show much emotion. She was almost strangely calm, I would say, as were the jurors, except for one, juror number 4, a woman. She appeared to be crying as the verdict was read. As soon as that first guilty verdict was read out loud, Katie Bryant, Daunte Wright's mother, she burst out sobbing. She was holding hands with Arbery Wright, Daunte Wright's father, the entire time. The Potters in there were Kim Potter's husband and I believe her 2 sons. The 3 of them were all clutching hands in the middle as one. Earl Gray, Potter's attorney, was visibly upset when the guilty was read out loud. We're down here now on the Skyway floor waiting for a press conference from Attorney General Keith Ellison, who led the prosecution in this case. There was a bit of debate back and forth after the jury left the room about whether Potter should be taken into custody now or be let out on bail. The judge decided she will be taken into custody, so Potter was handcuffed in the courtroom. When that happened, Potter's husband yelled out loudly from the back, "I love you, Kim." And she said more quietly, "I love you back." Again, she didn't show much emotion as far as I could tell. She did take her mask off while the verdict was being read, maybe so the jury could see her face more clearly, but she put the mask back on after the jury left. So I will keep you posted from here in the courthouse. We're down on the Skyway level waiting for Attorney General Keith Ellison, and we do not know yet if Potter's attorneys will have some sort of a press conference as well. I'm David Schumann, WCCO.
Glad we could bring you David's perspective from being actually inside the courtroom. And if Earl Gray and Paul Lang, Kim Potter's lawyers, have a press conference, we'll bring that to you live. And then we believe that we'll also cover the comments from Attorney General Keith Ellison. Katie Wright, and Katie Bryant and Aubrey Wright have a blended family of 7 children. And Kim and Jeff Potter. Jeff Potter's a retired police officer. Kim Potter is 49 years old and served as a police officer for 26 years. Have 2 boys, 2 sons. One is in the Marine Corps, and the other one is a college student in North Dakota. Joe Tamburino, let's bring you back on here as we wait and see if we're going to hear from some of these officials. And now she's facing, we think, about 12 years, Joe, but there's some factors that could change that number, correct?
Yes, what the guidelines call for is less than 12 years. It's 86 months on the top count and 48 months on the second count, second-degree manslaughter. But the prosecution is going for what's called an enhancement. They're going to be arguing that she should get more than the 86 months. How much more? We don't know.
I go back to think of some of her initial comments. She shot him. She realized she did. She immediately realized she had made a huge mistake, a deadly mistake, obviously. And some of her comments were, I just shot the boy, I killed him. Her other comment, I'm going to prison, which is now happening this afternoon. I wonder, Joe, are we ever going to get a sense from the jury of what was really weighing on them, why it took so long, what were the factors to get to this point? And I'm just trying to think of Kim Potter's own actions on tape and own testimony on the stand and how much of a factor that was.
Well, we will hear from the jury. There's no doubt. I mean, things in today's world come out in the wash. They always do. So just like in the Chauvin case, we started hearing from jurors within weeks. I'm sure we'll hear from them in this case. And the 2 big questions I would have is, number 1, what about the videos? Did they play the videos? Did they play them at normal speed or slow speed? And number 2 is, what about Ms. Potter's testimony? What did they think of it? Did they put weight to it? Meaning, did they consider it as equal or greater than other pieces of evidence? Or how did they weigh it? So those 2 things, the videos and Potter's testimony.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. You're looking live outside the Hennepin County Government Center in downtown Minneapolis. We're waiting for the Wright family to speak. That would be Katie Bryant and Aubrey Wright, the parents of Daunte Wright. As I mentioned, they testified they had a blended family of 7 kids. Frankly and sadly, I don't know if that means 6 children right now. I don't know if Daunte was included in that number or not. But we're waiting to hear from them. And then we thought we might hear from the defense team as well. And we did receive a press release that the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, would speak as well. He got involved in the case. You might remember this went out of Hennepin County into Washington County. Washington County prosecutor for the people who were protesting was not making a decision earlier enough. People actually went and protested in front of his home. He got into a discussion with them. There was a lot of ugliness around that, and then eventually the Attorney General took over and filed the manslaughter charges, manslaughter 1 and manslaughter 2. Manslaughter 1, of course, the more serious, that requires about an 8-year sentence in Minnesota. Man 2, about a 4-year sentence. But again, Joe, as we're waiting for them to talk, they're going to try to get even more time like they did with Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin had a sentence, and there was, in legal terms, an upward departure. They're going to try to do the same thing with Kim Potter, correct?
They will. What's different with Ms. Potter's case is the following. The aggravating factors are, if they exist, they're very little. Because in Mr. Chauvin's case, what we had, as we all know, was 9 minutes of Mr. Chauvin's knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. And there were young people, meaning juveniles, around. And there were a number of other factors that could be considered. In Ms. Potter's case, what we have, and everyone agrees to the facts, is obviously recklessness now, where she grabbed the gun instead of the taser. But it was a split-second decision, and there really doesn't appear to be any other factors that could, aggravate or give a greater sentence.
The state, of course, is going to argue, though, that, Daunte Wright sped off and hit this other couple and injured them. Will that carry a lot of weight, Joe? I mean, we've already heard the evidence on that.
We did hear the evidence on it, and I don't think that's going to carry a lot of weight, only because Ms. Potter's actions didn't directly cause the Lundgrens to have those injuries. It would be quite different if Ms. Potter, say, fired 2 or 3 shots, one hit Mr. Wright and one hit somebody else, or one caused somebody else to have some harm. But when you have the disconnect of fleeing, I would imagine the prosecutors are going to give some, good argument for that, but it's a little bit tenuous.
Yeah, we see the podium set up, and there's some microphones on there now, and we believe that Katie Bryant, 43 years old, mother of Daunte Wright, and Aubrey Wright, her husband, we're expecting them to come out and say a few words. I don't know. Joe, do you know, are Ben Crump and some of this other legal team representing the Wright family? I don't know if they're in town or not. I didn't ask David Schuman today.
I don't know either. I haven't heard anything about that.
But I'd imagine they're retained because a step coming up for the Wright family is to try to bring some kind of civil case against the city of Brooklyn Center.
That's correct, and that will all depend upon Brooklyn Center's insurance policy. As compared to Minneapolis, such as in the Chauvin settlement or the Ruschek settlement, Minneapolis is self-insured, which means that the city could arrive at whatever number they deem appropriate. But most municipalities have insurance, just like in the Philando Castile case where Geronimo Yanez was tried. Their insurance policy, I believe, had a $3 million cap, which is quite common for smaller municipalities.
Yeah, which Brooklyn Center is. In Minneapolis, actually right before the trial started, they awarded the Wright family $27 million. And in the Justine Ruschek-Damon case, they awarded her family $20 million. And then there's this odd twist in the Daunte Wright situation in that someone's already filed a civil action against his estate because they're going to try, and I don't know how they're going to do it without the criminal case, but try to prove that Daunte Wright's responsible for putting this young man in a hospital with a gunshot wound.
Yes, but that's really not going to affect the civil case of the family members of Daunte Wright. Here's why. When you do a wrongful death action, say the mother sues the city, the award or whatever is agreed upon goes directly to the mother. It doesn't go first to Mr. Wright's estate and then get split up. That's not how it works. So anyone could sue Mr. Wright's estate. I doubt it will have any money. When the lawsuit happens against the city, that award, whatever it is, goes to the actual claimants, the family members. So there are two different things between the Wright estate and the wrongful death claim.
Interesting. Kim Potter, 26 years as an officer, Joe, and she has extraordinarily clean record and does a lot of volunteer work, and the court thought that, oh, well, hang on, folks. It looks like these people are getting ready to go to the podium. I was going to toss one of the sound bites. The defense made a motion. They tried to, they said, hey, it's Christmas. She's not a threat to public safety. There's no evidence she's going to flee. She's not a danger. She's remorseful. So, and she has a $100,000 bail. So please don't put her in jail right now. Judge Chu listened to those arguments, and then she heard from the prosecutors who said she caused a death and it's serious. And it's customary in these crimes to go to jail, and the judge agreed with the prosecutors and put her in custody immediately. And Kim Potter actually rolled up the sleeves of her sweater, put her hands behind her back, and the bailiff put her in custody in handcuffs and took her away. This is Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. He took over the prosecution of the Derek Chauvin case. His office did. To his left in the red tie is Josh Larson. To his right is Katie Bryant in the red sweater with the gray jacket and the black mask. And behind, who just rubbed his head, is Aubrey
Hello, everybody. My
Wright,
name is Keith
Daunte's
Ellison.
father.
I'm the Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. At this moment, I ask us all to reflect upon the life of Daunte Wright and who he could have been had he had a chance to grow up. At 20, Daunte could have done anything. Maybe he could have gone into the building trades. Maybe he could have started a business. What we know is that he was a young, new dad, and he was so proud of his son, Daunte Jr. We know that he loved his mom, and he loved his dad, and he loved his siblings, and his big, beautiful family. He had his whole life in front of him, and he could have become anyone. All of us miss out on who Daunte could have been. And no one has missed him more than his parents, Katie and Aubrey, and their children. I'm very mindful today that there will be an empty chair at the Wright family dinner during the holidays, and that saddens me. And once again, I extend my deepest condolences to you. With the jury finding Kimberly Potter guilty today of manslaughter in the first degree and manslaughter in the second degree in connection with Daunte's death, we have a degree of accountability for Daunte's death. Accountability is not justice. Justice is restoration. Justice would be restoring Daunte to life and making the Wright family whole again. Justice is beyond the reach that we have in this life for Daunte. But accountability is an important step, a critical, necessary step on the road to justice for us all. I want to thank the jury for their careful attention and deliberation and for their service to the people of Minnesota. I want to thank all of the witnesses who testified and who came forward with what they knew about this case. I especially want to thank my remarkable team. When I took this case, I said it would be difficult to prosecute because history has shown that trying cases like this one is difficult. This team did not shy away from the challenge, and the people of Hennepin County and the American people and the people of Minnesota, what they saw in the courtroom was the fruit of many, many hours of labor and hard work and planning. From my office, I want to thank specifically Mr. Matthew Frank. Matthew. I want to thank Aaron Eldridge. I want to thank Eric Miller and David Voigt and Dion Dodd. But this team wouldn't be much of anything if it were not for the amazing work of Joshua Larson, Raul Shaw, and Vernona Boswell. Thank you, Vernona. I also must thank colleagues who did not work on the legal matter, but worked on the community, and that is John Stiles, Keon Dostey, and everyone. So thank you to you all for your hard work. I also want to thank the many staff at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension who worked on this case, the staff of the Hennepin County Attorney's Office and Washington County Attorney's Office. Specifically, I want to thank Mr. Drew Evans and those who testified in this case, like Agent Phil, who did a fine job and who put in many long hours. We appreciate their service. The next step in this case is sentencing. And all I will say about that today is that we have to look forward to the court setting a calendar date for that hearing. And at that time, we will make our appropriate arguments within the context of the court hearing. I think we have a date, do we not? What is that one? Anybody remember the date? March 8th. My thoughts are also with Ms. Potter today. She has gone from being an esteemed member of the community and honored member of a noble profession to being convicted of a serious crime. I don't wish that on anyone, but it was our responsibility as the prosecution, as ministers of justice, to pursue justice wherever it led, and the jury found the facts. My thoughts are also with those who work in law enforcement and public safety. We hold you in high regard, and we also hold you to high standards. We don't want you to be discouraged. Your community respects and appreciates you. We want you to uphold the highest ideals of our society and ideals of safety. And when a member of your profession is held accountable, it does not diminish you. In fact, it shows. It shows the whole world that those of you who enforce the law are also willing to live by it. And that's a good thing. It restores trust, faith, and hope. Well, in the words of Danielle Surratt is a noted author who writes on justice issues. Justice exists when all parties exercise their power in a way that is consistent with the humanity of everyone involved and in the interest of the greater good. The humanity of everyone involved includes the humanity of community members, and it includes the humanity of police officers. And when that standard of justice is not upheld, it must be the job of a prosecutor to step up and step in and attempt to uphold it and uphold the principle that no one is above the law and no one is beneath the law. Finally, my thoughts are with community of Brooklyn Center, residents, elected officials, and police officers, and all communities that hunger for a better relations between police and community, and for everyone to get home safe at the end of the day. I hope today's verdict provides a measure of healing for all of them. I thank you, and we can take a question or two.
Mr. Ellison, as this dragged on to the 27th hour, what was going through your mind and the prosecution team?
That the jury was taking this seriously, that they were going through every bit of evidence, that they were not leaving anything to the side, and that they understood that this matter was of tremendous importance to the Wright family, but also to the Potter family, to the entire community. So I thank them for their service.
Are you guys taking questions?
Let's get Storms. They want questions for the Wright family. Is that okay? Or
Yeah, they can.
okay, sure.
I want to ask you guys, and we were sitting right in front of you, but what were you feeling when you heard the word guilty? And what are you feeling now? Have you processed it? What's going through your head and heart right now?
Oh my gosh. The moment that we heard guilty on the manslaughter 1, emotions, every single emotion that you could imagine just running through your body at that moment. I kind of let out a yelp because it was built up in the anticipation of what was to come while we were waiting for the last few days. And now we've been able to process it. We want to thank the entire prosecution team. We want to thank community support, everybody who's been out there that has supported us in this long fight for accountability.
What did you think of Ms. Potter when she was on the stand last week?
I'd rather not answer that question.
Well, the truth be told, what do I think? I want to thank her. I'm going to keep it short.
Mr. Ellison, did you expect Officer Potter, former Officer Potter, to take the stand? And do you think that helped or hurt your case?
They said from the very beginning that she was going to testify. They said in jury selection. And she expressed herself immediately after this tragic incident on the scene. So I'm not too surprised. Look, it's a lot. I think that it's a good sign that she was remorseful. I mean, what decent person wouldn't be brokenhearted and sad if they were involved in something like this? So I wish nothing but the best for her and her family. But the truth is, she will be able to correspond with them and visit with them no matter what happens. But the Wrights won't be able to talk to Daunte.
With 2 high-profile guilty verdicts this year of police, what do you think that sends a message about police accountability?
I think that juries admire police, they respect them, and they want to make sure that high ideals and standards are maintained.
Can I ask you really quick, you had even a state witness testified that they may have used deadly force in a similar situation. Were you expecting one of your own witnesses to say that, and did you think that was going to be a hurdle to overcome?
I think that you're referring to the officers on the scene. Oh yeah, so I understand what you mean. We did call them. Well, we had confidence in the law and the facts, and we were very confident that Seth Stoughton was going to give clear testimony, and he did. So I think that's pretty much what we have time for now.
Yep. Really quick, what kind of sentence do you think you'll be calling for here?
A fair one. Sorry, I can't be more specific. But the main thing about sentencing is that the Wright family is going to be able to make a victim impact statement, and the most important thing may be that really for the first time they're going to be able to talk about how this tragic incident impacted them in their lives.
Thanks for talking.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So Attorney General Keith Ellison, along with Aubrey Wright, Daunte Wright's father, and Katie Bryant, Daunte Wright's mother. Mr. Wright was very brief. Katie Bryant was pretty brief as well. The Attorney General, a very different tone than when Derek Chauvin was convicted. He expressed certainly some remorse for the Potter family, as an obvious remorse for the Wright family for losing their son. And we could hear David Schuman asking a couple questions there. One of them, they asked Katie Bryant, what were you thinking about when Kim Potter took the stand last week? And she said, I'd rather not answer. And as far as the sentence goes, it wasn't like the Attorney General was beating the lectern. He said, calling for the stiffest thing. He said, I'd like something that's fair, and the Wrights will be able to make a victim impact statement as well. And then also talking about community relations, even addressing police in general, who, of course, sometimes in the police community, a verdict like this can have a very chilling effect. We know we've seen a number of officers retire in various communities, and certainly there's been a surge of crime in Minneapolis and St. Paul and throughout the Twin Cities and suburbs as well. So we're dealing with very complex and complicated issues. Joe Tamburino, anything that the Attorney General said that struck you or really stood out?
Yes, the prosecution will be moving to get a greater sentence, but the Attorney General held back on that in his press conference. Basically, it sounded like, obviously, he felt very sorry for the Potter family and acknowledged that some type of mishap happened. But of course, he wants accountability, which is understandable. But it was interesting the way he phrased it.
Yeah, I thought so too. This is the scene on Catherine and Brooklyn Center where Daunte Wright died. This isn't exactly where Kim Potter pulled him over, but his car drove a little bit further, about another block, where he hit another vehicle. And we heard from the medical examiner that he maybe had seconds or minutes to live, but not very long. But not a huge crowd gathered there. We see this one person lighting a candle. We saw Adam Duxter, our new WCCO reporter, in Brooklyn Center at the police department, and things were all quiet there. He said there was one person there earlier, and there's nothing there now. And he spoke to some folks in the community who expressed a big sense of relief. But this is the intersection where Daunte Wright passed away, and then we saw earlier outside of the government center maybe about 150 people that were cheering and applauding the verdict. Yeah, I noticed that too, Joe. You know, his quote was a fair sentence. He said he's happy the Wrights can make a victim impact statement, but, you know, bringing up other police departments, he said Potter is part of an honorable profession, and he doesn't want other people in law enforcement to be discouraged. It kind of goes back to some of those issues that a lot of people talk about in this case. It's just sad overall, and it's even, I think, even a little sadder when you realize there were a number of things that happened if you watch this trial for 9 days where you realize it didn't have to end this way. With the death of a 20-year-old man and with a 49-year-old woman heading to prison. Oh, Joe.
It was extremely sad, very sad.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting that his statements kind of reflect a little bit of that, or maybe it's just the fact that our community's been through so much in 18 months as a greater population. Oh, I think we lost Joe. This is what's happening outside the government center. We'd imagine we'll see if the Daunte Wright's parents go ahead and come out here. They might. I'd imagine they'd be met with a lot of cheers and some hugs as well. We thought we may hear from the defense team, but we did not. If they were going to speak, we had the idea that they would go ahead and talk before Attorney General Keith Ellison, but now that we've gone ahead and seen them, we're not expecting that to happen. Not to say it wouldn't later, and we'll certainly be ready and aware for that as well. Kim Potter was very stoic. We saw a very, very emotional former police officer on the stand testifying about when the day she shot Daunte Wright. When it came up in testimony, she would cry and get very emotional. But today when the sentence was read, few facial expressions, but not tears, not the collapsing that we saw on the ground the day she shot Daunte Wright on April 11th. It was a much more stoic Kim Potter. And we have a reporter in court, David Schuman. He said he could hear her husband, Jeff, who's a retired Fridley police officer, say, "I love you, Kim," and she turned around and said, "I love you," back to him.
We do request that the defendant be taken into custody. The convictions here are for manslaughter in the first degree, manslaughter in the second degree, based on the death of Daunte Wright, a young man. In other words, it's a case that involves death. They are very serious charges. It is customary for defendants to be taken into custody upon a guilty verdicts for those level of crimes, and we don't think this case should be any differently. Your Honor, we also have learned that the defendant is not living in the state. I don't know if that was known and provided for in the original conditions of release, but it presents obviously an aggravating factor for allowing her to remain out of custody. So we are requesting that the state remand her into custody and withdraw any bail or conditions of release. Your Honor, we do have the Blakely issue to resolve, and we would be asking some direction from the court on whether we should submit written arguments or proposed findings, or how the court exactly wants to address that. It would be good to have those findings, of course, for the actual sentencing hearing, and we would request a PSI as well.
Judge, may I respond?
Yes.
It's a serious crime, I understand that, but both of those crimes, there's no intent, no criminal intent. It's reckless and culpable negligence. Many times in my career, I've had defendants convicted of culpable negligence. I don't think I've ever had a reckless one, but it's an unintentional crime by somebody with a clear record, and we have a strong basis for a dispositional departure. I asked the court to release her on the bail. Shirley will reappear.
Okay. The presumptive sentences in this case are commits, and I am going to require that she be taken into custody and held without bail. And I recognize your arguments, Mr. Ng and Mr. Gray, but I cannot treat this case any differently than any other case.
And a few moments after that, Kim Potter stood up. She rolled up the sleeves of her sweater, put her hands behind her back, and bailiff, the Hennepin County Sheriff, put her in handcuffs, and she will now be heading to jail awaiting her sentencing, which will happen in March. This is the family attorney for the Wrights outside of the government center right now.
To turn our attention towards ensuring that Kim Potter gets the strongest and most just sentence possible. Listen! And as we think about that as a community, let's reflect on how other people of color in Minnesota and across the country have been sentenced before.
That's right.
Say that. Now, we also have to turn our eye towards the system that made Kim Potter. Brooklyn Center, why does your officer not know the difference between a sidearm and a taser? Why do you have this beautiful, grieving family here today and an officer who gets on the stand and just says, I don't know the difference. I don't know what kind of taser I use. I can't remember anything. Those days are over.
That's right.
Those days are over. So now, the most important people for y'all to hear from are the family. So I wanted to keep these remarks short. So, Katie, would you like to say a couple things?
Go ahead.
Katie!
How do I use this thing?
All right.
First and foremost, thank you, everybody that is out here today. You
Mike check!
You gotta literally go like this, Mike. I held it.
Hello. Like you gotta talk into it.
Like touch my lips to
Yeah,
it?
put your mask on.
It was only my lips on it, love. First off, we want to say thank you to everybody who's out here. You guys helped us make this happen. Today, we have gotten accountability. Yes. And that's what we've been asking for from the beginning all the way up until today. And because of that is because of all of you that have stood with us in solidarity, who have said his name numerous nights every day from the day that Daunte was murdered all the way up until today. Right. We love you. We appreciate you. And honestly, we could not have done it without you.
Yeah. And it's Dante's favorite number. Today's the 23rd.
And just side note, Dante's favorite number was 23, and today is the 23rd.
Yeah. Let's go!
There's Daunte right there.
Go ahead, Pop.
Showing it right on it.
First of all, I would like to say thank the prosecution because they fought very hard for us. You know, and I would like to say thank you to people for the people because we couldn't have done it without you guys. The love, the support is what kept us going. It's been a lot of nights where we thought we couldn't make it and we would read messages and stuff from people. Everybody here know I really don't talk much, but I want to say thanks for the love and the support that you guys are showing us. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Today, Minnesota has shown that police officers are not going to continue to pull their gun instead of their taser. And we made this happen. You made this happen. Daunte Wright made this happen. And we're going to continue to say his name along with so many other names until we don't have to say any more names.
I just briefly, before we turn it over to more members of the family, obviously there's been a lot of help from outside Minnesota and throughout this country to come in and make sure we've helped hold people accountable. And, you know, those individuals, of course, include some of the lawyers we
This is what's happening outside of the government center right now. Katie Bryant thanking people, saying you helped make this happen. Aubrey Wright. It really doesn't speak as much, and he even mentioned how he was much more quiet and thanking people for their love and support. And then some other comments from this attorney that were certainly a departure from what the Attorney General said, wanting to push for the strongest sentence for Potter, talking about the system needing to be fixed where an officer doesn't know the difference between their gun and their taser. So, Joe, I can't imagine that his comments are going to carry as much weight as the Attorney General. The Attorney General, I thought, was much more staid and much more measured. He said, you know what, we just want a fair sentence, and he acknowledged the police profession, and he acknowledged that Kim Potter has a really impeccable record.
Yes, I thought this attorney really wasn't sounding appropriate for this period of time. The Attorney General was. The Attorney General was measured. He said he wanted a fair sentence. This attorney, I really don't know why he was saying all of that at this time.
No, either do I. Joe, stick around because David Schuman was one of the pool reporters actually in the courtroom when the verdict was read, and he joins us now live from the government center. David, take it away. I know you have a lot to share. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was one of two reporters that got to be in the courtroom while the verdict was read. There was a lot going on that you didn't see on TV. I'll run through some of that now from what I can remember. It's been a lot, of course. But first of all, they cleared the entire courthouse of anyone not involved with this trial. So when they read the guilty verdict, as soon as they said that word guilty, Katie Bryant, Daunte Wright's mother, immediately burst into sobbing and leaned into her husband, Arbery, and he comforted her. On the other side, I noticed Potter's supporters. It was her husband and I believe her two sons. They have been there previous days during this trial. They had their 6 hands all clutched together as one. Really not much reaction when they heard the guilty verdict, and same with Potter herself. She had her mask off. She was looking at the jury, and she, I thought, was almost strangely calm, really didn't show any emotion. Earl Gray, her attorney, actually was more visibly upset. He threw his hands up as soon as he heard the word guilty, and he also, at one point, even put his face down directly on the table while the judge was speaking, and Potter just pretty much stared straight ahead at the jury. The jury also was staring at her relatively blankly. Again, the caveats that they were wearing their masks, so it's a little hard to tell what's going on with their faces and their emotions, but there was one juror, a woman, who she was visibly upset. She appeared to be crying, and a man next to her, her fellow juror, reached out his hand, comforted her a bit, but other than that, there wasn't much from the jury there. And then the judge said her piece, thanking the jury for their service and how important what they do is to the justice system, and they left. And as soon as they were sort of working out now whether Potter would be taken into custody or out on bail, Potter had put her mask back on at this point, and she is pretty much just sitting there. She was fiddling with a piece of jewelry, it looked like, which she later handed to one of her attorneys before she was put into handcuffs. The other notable moment was when she was put into handcuffs and the court had basically been dismissed, her husband from the back of the room said pretty loudly, "I love you, Kim," and she responded a bit more quietly. She said, "I love you." And then all the prosecutors hugged the Wright family. They hugged Daunte Wright's parents, and Katie started sobbing again. And they left the room, and Potter was let out, and her family went out a different back door to follow her. I don't know how much contact they're going to be having with her, but they set a sentencing date, and that was kind of it. And then we came down to the floor, and the ground floor, and heard from Attorney General Keith Ellison, and a few questions were answered by Daunte Wright's parents as well.
Yeah, those are really emotional moments for all parties involved, and I think for the community as well. So, yeah, it was something to see, David. Conventional wisdom, talking to people in there, I mean, these deliberations go on at least 27, maybe 28 hours, give or take. Were people thinking split verdict between man one and man two, or were they thinking not guilty, or was the conventional wisdom hung jury?
I think after we heard, I believe it was 2 days ago, that the jury came in and asked what to do if they couldn't reach an agreement, that seemed to be our only indication that we could be heading for a hung jury. And then with all this time passing, that also, is kind of what everyone was thinking. But of course, it has to be said, you don't know, because only the 12 people in that room know. So it really is just speculation. But when the verdict, when it was announced that there was an outcome, they didn't use the word verdict, they used outcome. So that sort of leaned one way into thinking that this could have been a hung jury, but I actually got with the court communications staff, and they said that that language was pre-approved and was not an indication of whether there was a verdict or not. So when they came back in the room and there was a verdict, well, everyone kind of just braced themselves for what was to come.
Yeah. David Schuman, we appreciate it. David's going to put all of this information, along with the rest of our reporters and crew, into a very understandable version that will bring you on our news at 5 and 6 and 10 o'clock tonight. And also want to alert you right now that coming up on our digital platform, CBSN Minnesota, at 3:30, we'll hear from the mayor of Brooklyn Center. So the mayor coming up at 3:30, our continuing coverage as it warrants. If we need to break in with anything else, we will. If not, we'll see you here at 5 and 6 and have our full team working on the verdict against Kim Potter, guilty of manslaughter 1 and 2 in the case of Daunte Wright.
Andrea.
An original documentary on CBSN.
We need to put an end to this territorial status.
Will statehood create a better Puerto Rico?
So that we have the same quality of life that you see in the States.
What do you worry about?
Me living here in the future.
They're giving incentives to non-Puerto Ricans to come to Puerto Rico
and extract our natural resources and take over our land.
Vacation in Puerto Rico, and in exchange for that, you don't pay taxes.
Why would I allow somebody who abused me for 123 years to then consume me?
An originals documentary on CBSN. Stream now. An original documentary on CBSN.
50 shows running, the lights blinking.
People fight their entire career to get to Broadway.
You've trained your entire life.
Spotlights, drama, passion.
This is what we live for.
Until COVID turned off the lights.
It's like going from a bright light to pitch black.
Scenes from Broadway's unique struggle with COVID.
It was devastating.
Broadway contributes about $15 billion to New York City's economy and 100,000 jobs.
The sound team, the lighting team, everyone.
The world does not realize how big this is.
This is how we make money.
This is a specialized industry. You don't tell a doctor to go get a serving job. Like, why are we different?
Are we going to be able to pay our rent? Am I going to have food?
What will happen in Broadway's new opening act?
We're in uncharted waters again.
The show must go on.
There is reason to hope again.
I think people are going to be crying. I know I will.
An originals documentary on CBSN. Stream now.
Everything was on fire.
You're left making decisions you don't want to make.
If we're at war at fire, we're going to spend a lot of money, we're going to take a lot of casualties, and we're going to lose.
We got to do something about it.
If it's important to our nation,
the country is facing yet another unprecedented crisis.
It's on Face the Nation.
You heard the president. Where do you think this stalemate goes from here?
Making politics make sense.
What do you think happened here?
The why behind the biggest stories. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
A hidden time capsule found inside a controversial statue has been open for the first time in more than 130 years. The capsule was discovered in the pedestal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Workers found the lead container while dismantling the remaining pieces of the statue. The bronze figure was removed earlier this year following nationwide racial justice protests after the murder of George Floyd. CBS News correspondent Courtney Keeley has the latest on the historic discovery.
A surprise discovery. A time capsule found last week buried more than 130 years beneath the statue of Confederate General Robert E.